one of the interesting things is that they are very, very homogeneous in their thinking. And they all have probably 30% of them have a PPE degree from Oxford.
Yeah.
And you will literally have an occasion, and I think the Observer pointed this out actually, that you will have an occasion where a minister who did PPE at Oxford is being interviewed by a journalist who did PPE at Oxford, having been briefed by a flaming civil servant who did PPE at Oxford, and then is questioned on the journalistic press. I mean, this is horrendous because it's like trying to govern London when you've only got an understanding of the tube map.
I want your views on university degrees, because you've argued actually that, and I think this is really interesting because I've not heard anyone say this before, but you've argued that it's a bit like luxury goods signaling, where you buy your Gucci and your Prada and your belts, etc., etc. Could you just elaborate your thoughts on that? And do you think it's just a con? Is it a waste of money? Are my generation absolute bloody morons for doing it?
It's become a bit like dressing for dinner in the 19th century, which is that you have to, even if you don't want to go to university, even if you just want to go into, surveying, and you could learn more on the job. And the job would also be a better measure of your ability than some proxy measure through a degree. They reached a point when Blair expanded universities to 50% of people, where it actually became a decision not to go for many forms of employment. And I think a lot of people who would prefer to have earned money and started out in the world of work now find that more or less impossible, because companies have been particularly moronic about this, because they're increasingly using your degree class in some totally arbitrarily related subject as a proxy for your employability. And what's very interesting is that, oddly, people who talk about sort of diversity, are weirdly non-diverse. They're very, very diverse about sexual preference, ethnicity, whatever, and gender, fully believing in diversity on that. But you can't really challenge their belief that somehow your degree qualification is a measure of your worth as a human being, which seems to be a form of prejudice every bit as perverse as, let's say, homophobia or ethnic prejudice. Because if you want to know how good, I asked a friend about this, and bear in mind he had a double first in maths from Cambridge, and he got a job at Goldman Sachs. And I said, what's the half-life of the value of your degree? By which I mean, how long have you got to be working at Goldman Sachs or another financial institution in London for your degree not to be very important? And he said, to be honest, after about 4 years, it will be pretty irrelevant to my future employment prospects.
Wow.
Because how good I am at my job, who I work with, what I've done, is more important as a measure of my ability than what I happen to do in abstruse maths problems 5 years ago. Now, there are jobs, particle physicist, where your mathematical ability will remain absolutely decisive and become, throughout your whole life. I guess. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny number of jobs. And I came across somebody and I realized the system was broken. Because what it is, it's a classic case of a coordination problem, which is what every company is doing looks perfectly sensible. We're going to try and get the best graduates. So they've got to have a 2-1 and above. We'll choose this. We'll interview them and we'll look at their degree class. And we'll use their degree as a kind of proxy for the sorting hat for who gets a job. And then I met somebody who I think they got a 2-2 in maths from Cambridge, and they couldn't get an interview. I said, no, hold on a second. Everybody is using 2-1 and above. Some people may go Russell Group University only, 2-1 and above, and some people are going any old university, 2-1 above. But hold on, I said, I've never come across anything so mathematically abstruse in my 30 years of working at Ogilvy than someone who got into Cambridge to read maths and then managed to pass the finals exam, was incapable of solving it, no one's ever come to me and said, I've got this problem with set theory. And the second one is, if you did have that kind of problem, you, by dint of having been where you were, you probably know some people who got some firsts in maths in Cambridge, and you could bring them up and you could ask. And they'd probably do it as a favour. So I said, I don't understand why this 2-2 in maths from Cambridge in any way is a reliable indicator for your quality of, if you want to do it statistically, my guess would be that simply because of Bill Gates and Zuckerberg, Harvard dropouts on average are going to be about 100 times richer than people who get a Harvard degree.
Yes.
If you want to do rubbish statistics, it is a terrible statistical thing. But actually, it's possible that the wealth of everybody who dropped out of Harvard is greater than the combined wealth of everybody who completed the degree.
So are you vehemently opposed to Blair's push for this, famously the 50%?
Yeah, because I think one of the things you need to do is you need to create... This is the thing I don't understand about libertarians. They're always obsessed with government intrusion on their freedom. But as John Stuart Mill said quite rightly, an awful lot of the impositions on our freedom are actually the product of social convention or norms, right? And libertarians never seem to talk about those. They seem to assume there's this system by which perfect norms arise through some kind of process of filtering. And I'll give you one example, I would say, which is that business travel was in many ways just a social norm. It was an obligation because if you didn't do it, you looked like the lazy guy. Mm-hmm. And what the pandemic has revealed is that a lot of it was probably unnecessary and counterproductive and extremely tiring and environmentally damaging.
Yes.
And I suspect, by the way, that before the pandemic, everybody on the planet in a business believed that they themselves could be trusted to work from home, but nobody else could.
Yes. Yes.
And it was a complete... the fact that when Zoom got half decent, we weren't at least... I can defend myself on this. 18 months, 2 years ago, I was experimenting with Zoom Fridays at the office with my team of sort of 12 people and saying, okay, let's all try working from home simultaneously and see how it goes.
Given that you have tested it out good and proper, as it were, do you find that you lose anything? Do you lose that intimacy, that trying to get that connection that you can only perhaps get in person? And that's what a lot of people have reservations with as far as masks are concerned as well, isn't it? That sort of human interaction, they feel like that's lost.
Yeah, it is a bit. I'm not disputing that. I would also argue that wearing a mask for a prolonged period of time is mildly unpleasant. My only argument is that in terms of what you might call the simple cost benefit analysis, it seems a relatively small cost. I don't understand why people aren't allowed to drink outdoors in pubs, outside of pubs, by the way. It's not that cold at the moment, is it? Really?
No. Yeah, I'm from the northeast, Rory. It's not that cold at all. Now,
you're going out in a t-shirt still, obviously, aren't you?
Yeah, obviously, yeah, exactly. Safe on the coat, hanging up my coat. Now, there's.
But by the way, I'm not very dogmatic about this. What I am worried about is the increasing homogeneity of thought in our political and economic class. And this is why I voted Remain but converted to a Brexiter after the result, because I was so horrified at the reaction of ardent Remainers that they struck me as being part of a weird cult or a kind of fact-based religion. They had 3 economic facts and they seem to have constructed some sort of religious system of belief on economic data, which didn't really concern them much before the Brexit vote, incidentally. It wasn't as if all these people were desperately concerned with the car industry or the fluidity of exports or trade beforehand. But suddenly they acquired this missionary zeal for... And I just thought these people are incapable of seeing the world through more than one lens. And you can be as intelligent... Well, this is one of the things that bothers me about university, is that what it seems to be creating is a kind of... First of all, it partly arises from the fairness industry, which is the idea that everything has to be fair. And my argument is that life's going to be pretty unfair anyway, because, people are just fucking unlucky. Okay, right? Shit happens randomly all over the place. But what you can much more interestingly aim for is diversity of opportunity and breadth of opportunity rather than equality of opportunity. Let me explain the difference, okay? If you want equality of opportunity, what does that mean? It means that everybody has to be given the same test. You have to actually impose the same conditions and the same sorting hat on everybody in order to maintain this myth of fairness, that we've all had the same opportunity. If you apply the same criteria to everybody, what you end up doing is massively elevating a talent for, let's say, academic theoretical exercise behavior, or pattern recognition, or simply post-rationalized storytelling, which might be valuable in a lot of academic disciplines, or bullshitting, to be absolutely honest. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of bullshit goes on in university essays. It's basically judging you on the quality of your bullshit. Okay, now if you apply the same criteria to everybody, you actually end up with a very, very poor outcome, because the same people win at everything. Now, the only meritocratic businesses, I would argue, are things, I don't know if this is still true, but in organizations like McDonald's, you can say what you like about McDonald's, but you could start at the drive-through window and make it to the boardroom, right? Now, it would take time and it would require luck, fair, you'd have to be lucky, talent, dedication, some fairly rare abilities, but you could do that. Now, your ability at running a burger company is much more accurately measured by employing you at McDonald's and seeing how good you are than it is by setting a load of proxy tests.
Yeah.
As you know. And particularly, by the way, at the top, proxy tests aren't bad at weeding out people who are bad. Then this is Nassim's work on IQ, which is fascinating, which is the actual correlation between IQ and life outcome in financial terms is true. There is a correlation. However, if you split people in two, the correlation is very strong in people of significantly below average intelligence, and it disappears as you move right across the bell curve, right? Now, so the idea that someone with an IQ of 70 is going to do quite badly, that's what IQ was originally designed for. It was weeding out people who were significantly disadvantaged intellectually and for whom special educational treatment was necessary, or remedial education was necessary. Okay, perfectly laudable aim. It then became a kind of weird competition where people genuinely believed either that, the bullshit they're taught at university, or their innate intelligence, as signaled by their ability to process the bullshit at university, was somehow a measure of human worth. And if you look at it, it's very interesting, because you'd expect exactly this. Think about it, okay? Let's say you were you wanted to tell who could be a good soccer player, and the only way you're allowed to tell how good they were at soccer, i.e. working in a company, was by getting them to play cricket, i.e. taking exams, right? Okay, now it's perfectly fair to say that education works very importantly at the bottom level, at the level of primary, secondary education. If you've passed no GCSEs, okay, and you've got a D in English or whatever it might be, okay, it's probably pretty unlikely, not impossible, but it's unlikely that you're going to become a journalist. Certainly not impossible, okay, but the odds are reduced. The proxy measure is helping you a bit there. Okay. If you argue that the only journalists must be people who've got a first-class degree in English, you're looking at the opposite angle. You're looking at the proxy measure, not to weed out people who are likely to be unsuccessful, but to select for the very best. Now here, if you look at this, okay, now if you imagine you're using people's baseball ability to decide, or cricketing ability, to decide who plays football, right? You'd expect the proxy to be quite reliable at the left-hand side, in the sense that people who are totally shit at cricket are going to be shit at football. It's okay, there will be exceptions, but overall, okay, someone who basically just can't hit a ball, right, is probably not going to be brilliant at kicking one either, right? But on the other hand, to take that and extrapolate from that correlation and say that therefore the best cricketers will also be the best footballers is clearly a bit of a nonsense.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Now,
and the other thing you're trying to do, by the way, is you're trying to weed out luck, which is an essential part of the system. Now, a lot of businesses succeed just because they're lucky. A lot of business people are arseholes, they're idiots, they're very stupid, okay, but they happen to stumble on an idea. Now, they never believe this of themselves, but they happen to stumble on an idea that nobody else stumbled on, that happens to be particularly popular with the public for reasons the public never anticipated. Okay, now, by the way, I'm not denigrating James Dyson here, who seems to be a very smart and urbane guy, but there was nobody sane before the Dyson vacuum cleaner came along who thought there was a market for a £700 vacuum cleaner. If he'd come to see me, I would have said, Jim, don't give up the fucking day job, right? Because and then he'd say, but wait, you haven't heard about my £500 hairdryer, and I would have had him escorted out of the building. But nonetheless, he's right, I'm wrong, he's a billionaire, I'm not, right? Very simple. Now, actually, if we didn't reward people for being lucky, most of capitalism wouldn't work, because a very
Yes.
large part of capitalism arises through a Darwinian process of selecting for the companies that succeed, no matter what the reasoning was that led to their success. The problem in the Soviet system is that the quality of your reasoning is more important than the quality of your results. And I think that we're creating a sort of Soviet approach to capitalism.
If we think about monopolies, business monopolies, and crazy ideas, I would argue actually that the license fee, and I know you speak about this, the license fee, as far as the technology is concerned, right? It used to the case where my mother could, in the 70s, place the aerial onto the top of her television via a coat hanger or whatever, and receive next door's signal. Now, of course, Rory, that as you well know, that is no longer the case, right? Because some clever guy has come across with some expedient idea that allows us to subscribe via a login, and it's no longer the case that I can attach and receive the signal from next door. So I'm sort of lost as to where your argument is on the technology. You don't think it's quite advanced as much as that sort of reductive argument is?
It may be welfare enhancing, because if I get some sport for free, I wouldn't pay for any sport. Okay, not interested, right? That's not quite true. I pay quite a lot for weird niche things like sailing, and if ever there were a croquet channel or a bridge channel, I might, but I wouldn't pay for mainstream soccer. But nonetheless, I probably watch a few hours in a year for which I don't pay. Okay, now it might be simply cheaper. Okay, if the point I'm making is that if I simply consumed content on a pay for what you want basis, regardless, there's also an argument about what you might call national cohesion, that those mass channels create a lot of shared conversational value, because not all the value in watching TV is in watching it, it's also in talking about it. And generally, ITV or BBC One are a bit more talkable at the water cooler than Sky Crime, or I do try and start conversations with people about Fred West, but about 3/4 of them back away. So that's one of my weird passions. True life crime, but it's complicated, because by making it in a package, you basically mean that, okay, I get a bit of niche content that I wouldn't otherwise get, because the sports fans are kind of paying a bit towards it. And I get to watch, they occasionally get to watch, some art house film or something a bit obscure, which they wouldn't have watched otherwise. I occasionally watch half an hour of football, right? Which I do occasionally. I always regard it as slightly pretentious, just because I'm not very interested in football, to claim to actually despise it. If it's on the television, I haven't got much else to do, I'll watch it for 20 minutes. I just can't understand painting my face in allegiance to a particular team, it's not an unpleasant activity to watch. It's not as attractive as cricket or baseball, obviously. Not as civilized as golf or cricket, or baseball for that matter. But nonetheless, it's not a totally ugly experience to watch it. And therefore, the argument about resource pooling might make sense. But there's a further thing, which is simply a psychological thing, which is there are a lot of things where people don't want to pay for everything they get. Okay. Now, the low-cost airlines have made a bit of an extreme of this, where you pay for the meal, you pay for this. Now, okay, that's a 3-hour experience, right? And I can understand you may want to make the trade-off. No, I'm flying to bloody Paris. Why the hell would I want to eat on the plane, right? I'm only going for the weekend, so I can make do with hand luggage. That's paying for everything you get. I basically follow the Austrian view, okay, which is that value is created in the human mind. The only useful definition of value is what someone's prepared to pay for something. And as with the license fee and as with the NHS, to me, it's a perfectly reasonable defense of the system, even if the system may have inefficiencies and may not cater perfectly to my own particular tastes and needs. It is a defense of a system that simply people prefer paying that way. Because if you think about Netflix, okay, Netflix is sort of the BBC, because if you want to actually watch interesting shit, and not look like a fucking Luddite in front of your friend, you can't. You've got Netflix, right?
Yes, absolutely,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, okay. No, okay, it's sort of voluntary. Yeah, I get that, but I would, I can't really work in advertising and not watch, Game of Thrones or something. I have to be, reasonably, in with the zeitgeist as far as I find possible. And people don't say, no, I don't like Netflix because why do I have to pay for? How come I've got to pay for Game of Thrones when I don't like wizards? Right? I would, I don't. Funnily enough, I love Game of Thrones, even though I generally don't like wizards and elves and things.
Yes.
I'm not a Tolkien person. I just, I'm Welsh, so I can accept dragons because that's plausible. Okay, I think that's acceptable, right? But I don't buy into the whole fucking goblin stuff, really. But strangely, I thought Game of Thrones as a parallel universe was
that's
somehow,
HBO, not Netflix.
Yeah, that's HBO.
Yes,
You're absolutely right. It was on Sky, in fact, wasn't it? Sky Atlantic.
It was, yes, exactly, exactly. But I mean, I see, I get the argument that you're making, but many would argue, and I include myself in that, the BBC has grown on taxpayer funds into this hydra-headed monopolistic monster with, multiple TV channels, its revenues totally disconnected from its ratings, quality and impartiality, irrespective of whether its programmes are popular or not. We, as taxpayers, if I want to watch Newcastle United get thrashed in real time on Sky Sports, for example, I have to have a licence fee, and I'm obliged to fund them. And it just begs the question, to me at least, without that linkage, what incentive does the BBC actually have to respond to the diverse tastes of the public, which you've just highlighted there? Not everyone who watches the BBC, after all, is a left-wing Islingtonian.
No, that's a completely separate argument, which is whether the people who work in the BBC are remotely representative of the people who watch it. And by the way, I think we can say, and I will say this as a proud ad guy, that ITV and Channel 4, now, the people who work at Channel 4 are not all Spectator reading Tories by any stretch, right? I imagine it's a pretty left of centre organisation. But they generally do a slightly better job of capturing the zeitgeist and the warmth of humanity. Things like Gogglebox, for example. They're kind of Shakespearean, they're kind of Fox, not Hedgehog programs. They accept that people are complicated and mixed, and and the very best of those kind of slightly trashy programs do nonetheless have that kind of talent of speaking to everybody. That you do get the feeling that there's an everyman watching, which you don't get on the BBC.
And it does what you said. It's that unifying force, isn't it? Because you can talk about it at work the next day.
Let's look at it another way. There weren't many ITV paedophiles, were there? Okay, Frank Boff, who's a bit pervy, went on to work for ITV. But you could certainly say the BBC. Now, there's an interesting question about that, which is, of course, they could never pay as much as ITV. So they generally kept the stars by indulging them.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. I suspect that was partly what was going on. I don't know. Because otherwise, if you didn't indulge them, they could go off to the other channel for more money. I don't know. Who can tell? But I would argue that ITV does a better job of capturing the public spirit and mood, i.e., it's not as relentlessly negative in its news coverage for the most part. It's not, it's got a bit more, it's got a bit more human warmth to the whole thing, which I think is probably fair, and that in the same way that the Guardian has many fine qualities as a newspaper, but a kind of general love of humanity, with all its faults, is not really one of its virtues. I think we can say,
Yes.
The one thing you do find on the right is there's a sort of acceptance of a degree of fallibility, which also brings with it, by the way, the possibility of forgiveness and redemption.
Well, I think they're two important values which really have been lost completely, and that explains this jump to cancel people for the incorrect view, etc., etc. But I mean, speaking of that incorrect view, research out in the Mail on Sunday at the weekend found that 74% of the BBC's comedy, for example, was taken up by comedians with publicly pronounced left-leaning or anti-Brexit views. Now, Another area would be in the BBC's radio ambitions. Putting aside the television side of things, it has actually crushed, arguably, regional radio stations, stifling innovation and competition.
I would also argue it's probably destroyed local television stations as well, because I mean, if you think about it, Birmingham, Alabama has a population of 250,000, and it has two 24-hour TV stations. They're not all dedicated to Birmingham, but in the morning they are. Alabama. Birmingham, England's got a population that's 8 or 10 times larger, and it's got none. And by the way, I think, you know, I'm a fairly committed localist, in that most problems. This is what bothers me about the I'm going to say the mainstream media and the technocratic elite. Here we go. Well, I'm starting to become a nut. That's the problem. Is they're useful words, but you do look like a nutter. MSM, you know. The approach to everything, and this is what university teaches you, I think. There's a great book, and it's written by a guy who's kind of a bit of a Marxist and a bit of an anarchist. I can't quite make him out. But it's called Seeing Like a State, and it's by a guy called James C. Scott. And it makes the point that when you try and govern something large and complicated from the center, you increasingly resort to inaccurate generalizations which completely fail to account for local specificity, right? And the technical fancy down word, which comes from philosophy via psychology, is you become nomothetic. You lay down generalized laws for the betterment of everything on the assumption that what's good for the average, or what's good for whatever averages you happen to be measuring, is good for everyone. In the same way that I suppose you could argue that people thought that globalization was great because it grew GDP, but they didn't really spend any time looking at the inequality of where the gains or losses fell, not least because the losses did not fall on them. The gains did. Yeah. Right. So the kind of people at the top, just as nobody in fucking politics recognized there was a property crisis caused by stupid rising property prices as a result of quantitative easing and low interest rates, which was screwing young people. Okay. They didn't notice it. Why? Because they're all middle aged. And if you're an MP, you actually got an allowance to buy a fucking house. Right. So every time property prices went up 15%, it never occurred to them this wasn't a good news story. Now, what I mean about the nomothetic, the opposite of nomothetic, by the way, is ideographic, because you do need both. Okay, and so you know, rising property prices were nomothetically good, but they were ideographically disastrous. You know, you could argue that free movement of people. You could argue that globalization in general was nomothetically great, but ideographically incredibly uneven. So that what you might call third-tiered cities and towns really got kind of stuffed. Yeah. So you view BBC or local radio or local television as being stuffed by the BBC? Yeah, well, one of the nice things about local radio and local news is you actually have good news stories. Yes. The real problem with journalists is Woodward. Every single bastard thinks they're Woodward or Bernstein, don't they? You know, essentially. And so the lower status thing in journalism, other than travel journalism, which is basically an organized system of bribery where you're given expensive holidays in exchange for writing nice things. Okay, the interesting thing there is that it's generally low status journalism to write a good news story. Okay, and so. One of the interesting things is that they are very, very homogeneous in their thinking, and they all have. Probably 30% of them wankers have a PPE degree from Oxford. Yeah, and you will literally have an occasion, and I think the Observer pointed this out actually, that you will have an occasion where a minister who did PPE at Oxford is being interviewed by a journalist who did PPE at Oxford, having been briefed by a flaming civil servant who did PPE at Oxford. And then is questioned on the journalistic. This is horrendous because it's like trying to govern London when you've only got an understanding of the tube map. And economics is such a load of bullshit. It really is total crap. So what do you think would solve it then? Would you force the BBC to sell a regional wavelength and
step away from it?
The one thing I would have is I think you need to have a national universal channel, and I would have a range of different prices you can pay for different. I would unbundle it. So what I was saying about bundling is it's not all bad, right? And I think there are intelligent ways you can unbundle things so that if you don't forget that, you know, that broadcast television was once effectively what is called, now hold on, let me get this right. There's a club good, there's a so it was non-excludable, okay, but equally it was not rivalrously consumed. In fact, you might argue that TV is actually non-rivalrously consumed, in that if 10 people watch a program, you'll get more pleasure out of it than if you're the only person watching. Okay, so there is a peculiarity there with TV, where actually having mass viewing figures, particularly mass simultaneous viewing, is quite valuable to what it is. Because the boring person just would take a kind of very, very single person view of the value of television. But television provides people with things to chat at work the following day, you know, coronations. Storylines or whatever, and that's why, you know, watching a soap opera which nobody you know watches is not really very rewarding after a time. You know, I used to watch Tour of Duty, which was set in the Vietnam War. Absolutely brilliant late night. It was a soap opera set in, you know, a military soap opera. Unfortunately, I had two other people at work who used to watch it as well, so we could actually chat about it. But so it's complicated. All I'm saying is that some degree of bundling, there's somewhere is a happy medium between complete pay as you go, which even Netflix hasn't attempted.
What about,
you know,
a sort of national trust style? You become a member.
Okay. There are certain things which just need to be universally broadcast to everybody because they do. Okay, and then I think you should be able to have different levels of membership, but where the lines between them are not drawn in the sand. So I would still be able to watch a bit of football now and then, and people who like football but hate you know, documentaries would be able to watch a reasonable quantity of documentaries. You could also sell things like the back catalogue. You could sell separately. You could sell the right to download. I mean, I didn't do this to sound good on the program. I spent it's worth remembering, okay, I spent about 4 hours until 2 o'clock this morning watching Kenneth Clarke's Civilization.
Yeah, I actually did during lockdown as well.
Yeah, okay. Now, it's complicated because you could argue, well, hold on, I've already paid for that, or my dad has through his license fee in 1960.
No, I personally think it's absolutely ridiculous that the BBC's just giving that archive away. It should be monetizing it.
But then, yeah, I mean, yeah, equally, you could argue, well, how on earth? I mean, it's very interesting. NASA, actually, you can use any of the NASA footage of the moon landings, for example, completely for free. That's why there have been quite a few documentaries made about it. NASA's argument is the US taxpayer paid for this, therefore we're not going to charge them to watch. So you could argue, my dad could argue, look, I've already paid for Kenneth Clarke's Civilization back in whatever. Okay. But on the other hand, it does seem weird not to monetize that to some degree.
At least internationally, right?
Yeah. There's also the thing that viewing figures alone don't capture the full story. I'll tell you so all I'm saying here is I don't buy the current BBC in its current form. I agree that it needs to have a cheaper option. I mean, it always had a black and white option historically. It's now more or less impossible to buy black and white television, but there you go.
And would you tier that cheaper option to watching live television elsewhere? Does that make sense?
Yes, interesting. I don't entirely know how I do this, but all I'm saying is there's a blurry happy medium somewhere to be found, and it will probably involve a bit of ingenuity. It could even involve a point system. Okay, so you could even price things by points. I mean, you could, because the interesting thing about viewing figures that ITV does measure. The one thing ITV wouldn't cater for is a small, poor audience, by and large. It would cater well for a small, rich audience, which is why Downton was so lucrative, okay? And why ITV has invested quite a lot in high-quality drama, because you get ABC One viewers for whom advertisers will pay a premium, okay? ITV can also charge a lot for a very large audience, Right. Now, I don't quite understand why the Graham Norton show doesn't take advertising. I don't quite understand why you couldn't just sell the format of the Graham Norton show, having established it. Why you couldn't just sell the whole thing, in the same way that cakey thing where they all go out into a field and
Great British Bake Off. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, the cake thing was kind of sold to Channel 4, wasn't it? Right.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Because, of course, Channel 4 didn't own the actual rights. It was the production company that owned the rights. Now, not quite sure that, that you're performing a massive Reithian service to the populace by having Graham Norton without ads, to be absolutely honest, right? The only point I am making is that it's not totally clear-cut how people want to pay and how you can get people to get the most possible value out of a television system, because if you over monetize it, actually they'll get less value out of it because they'll never experiment and they'll become narrower and narrower. And Netflix doesn't charge me for watching, if I decide to get into The Good Place or whatever, okay, it doesn't charge me for that because it knows that I need to discover it first in order to value it, and that Netflix, when I pay for Netflix, let's be absolutely honest about this, if I want to get really bitter about this, I'm paying for a hell of a lot of shit that right that I don't watch. I mean, a spectacular amount of stuff I'm not watching, but there's a value to knowing it's there if I need it. I mean, this is where it gets a bit complicated, because the goods dominant logic of economics, this is why I'm attacking economics. I'm not attacking intelligent economics, but the goods dominant logic of economics is not the same as service dominant logic. Okay. And goods dominant logic assumes, effectively, because the beginnings of economics were around things like grain, which were bought, they were in scarce supply, everybody wanted them, and once you'd eaten them, they'd gone for good. Okay. Now, lots and lots of products aren't like that. And so there's a value to me, and I can't quantify it and I can't fully explain it, just as there's a value in me having other people's kids educated, right? Because there is, right? Let's be honest about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's even now my children have left the school system. I don't totally grudge paying tax for my children to be educated, other people's children to be educated, because, it is valuable to me in all kinds of ways, living in a society where other people can read and write. There's a value to unwatched content, which is knowing that it's there. And so the point is, the Austrians got this right. They understood that value is actually psychologically driven, and that maybe the reason the NHS works is not because it's the perfectly efficient, it doesn't conform very well to the economic tube map. I get that. You could argue it occasionally drives perverse incentives. I get that. I get all that, that with the profit motive, there would be more incentive to innovate, probably by that as well. Do I think there should be some market-based forces in the thing, and that it shouldn't run on altruism, pure and simple? Yeah, I accept that, but I don't quite buy the idea that unless you can turn it into essentially McDonald's, that you're necessarily improving things. But just in the same way that, we kind of cocked up rail franchising, didn't we? By getting
I think that's true. I think that's true.
The mix of public good and private good, we got it wrong. But part of the value of the NHS is simply that that's how people like to pay for their health, right? Bad enough being ill without having a massive bill or worries about your insurance, okay? We just rather pay for our health that way.
Well, yeah, fine then. I wonder, because I'm conscious I've taken up quite a lot of your time, but I wonder if to just bring that BBC conversation to an end, you might, if was it in my gift and I was to make you Director General of the BBC, and you've got a lot of people who are saying, and I think you're right, I think they broadly agree with you, Rory, which is, I quite like there being a BBC there as a unifying national broadcaster, but I am pretty pissed off with it. I'm not going to lie. I'm pretty pissed off with the way in which it seems to be patronising and condescending and advocating everything that I do not believe in. And they say, well, come on.
Undoubtedly, but in fairness, Sky News, which is notionally independent, I think also blew this, because Sky News had a pretty Brexity audience. We had a list of the top 10 brands that actually correlated with with Brexit voting and the top 10 brands that correlated with voting Remain. And alongside Mature Cheddar and HB Sauce and a few other things, Sky News was one of the significantly Brexity brands.
I didn't know that. That's very surprising.
No, it wouldn't surprise me, actually.
It was Comcast.
Yeah, but interestingly, I think they kind of screwed it because you had a bunch of Sky News presenters who looked like they'd swallowed a wasp every time they mentioned anything to do with the thing. And, the body language alone was dubious, I thought. And, Sky News has also, I think, an opportunity. It'd be interesting to see how GB News does.
Yeah.
Because one of the things GB News claims to want to do is to have more positive news stories. And I'm sorry, I just to be clear on this, the news, in terms of its positive-negative bias, is utterly comical. It's largely driven by the fact that it's presented by a bunch of Oxford PPE graduates who went to Oxford with the people who are now in power, who think they'd be doing the job better than they would. And so it's essentially student rivalries carried on into the public sphere 10 or 20 years later. But the negativity of the thing is appalling. I mean, there is lots of good news about. Nobody's looking for it.
Yeah, it's the despite Brexit phenomenon.
Despite, God, don't even get me started. That's a complicated one.
So do you think GB News could do really, really well then? I think you're right that people don't like being negative, right? People don't like news providers being constantly negative.
Most people regard politics as basically like renewing their motor insurance, except it's every 5 years rather than every one. Okay? And it's something they'd rather just get out of the way, and they don't particularly as discussed at the national level. Local politics, I think, concern a lot of people. Okay? But most people aren't particularly interested in trade policy, or, I know everyone will say, but they should be, because of course it's really important. Well, yeah, Christ. Part of the reason for free trade is that scale and gains to scale is about the only way that economics has of improving things, because it has no capacity for imaginative intervention at all. Within the constraints of the model, all you can do is make things cheaper by making things more efficient. Okay, or so essentially it's just about dropping the price of things. Now let's look at what consumers actually do, right? If you look at Google search data, searches for cheapest have been falling consistently including post 2008, by the way. Searches for cheapest have been falling, and searches for best have been growing and growing and growing. Okay, that's evidence of what people actually care about. They'd rather have probably less shit of a higher quality, right? It's basically Diageo has this strategy for its booze brands. It just says we've got a very simple objective as a country, as a company. We just want people to acquire a taste and to know to demand a slightly better quality drink. And if you look at most consumer behavior, if you're not focused exclusively on the very poorest, what you see is exactly that. People don't want more stuff. They want better stuff. I would argue that the environment is part of better rather than more, by the way. In terms of impartiality, I think it's actually totally mistaken. I think if you look at LBC, okay, it's impartial across the aggregate of all programs, but you have presenters like James O'Brien, who undoubtedly leans pretty left and leans very heavily Remain, okay, in his slightly annoyingly Jesuitical way, okay. But you have Nick Ferrari, who's the main drive time thing, who undoubtedly leans right, okay. Yeah. And actually, that works, I listen to both. I'm not a nutter. I don't suddenly start sort of, going all red about it. But actually, that works. It makes sense. The idea that you've always got to give a counter position on everything, okay, is intensely boring, and it turns everything into which also, by the way, the idea that you've got to give two opposing extremes also gets rid of any kind of moderate or nuanced opinion. Try this, okay? You're invited to appear on TV, which I imagine happens occasionally, right? And if you just say, I have a deeply nuanced and complex view on this matter, and I don't really swing either way.
I wouldn't get booked again.
No. They ring back. They ring every time. They ring back 10 minutes later and say, I'm terribly sorry. No, actually, they don't ring back 10 minutes later. That would actually be polite. They ring back at 7 a.m, just as you're getting dressed to go into their bloody studio. And they say, you're no longer required.
Yes.
because we've decided to replace you with a story about goats. They haven't. They've replaced you with two extreme people on the program. One good thing about Zoom, actually, is that now the requirement to turn up at a studio at ridiculously short notice is no longer which basically means that journalists end up inviting other journalists on. And this evening we have what's his name? Owen Jones?
Yes.
Then you say the same about Julia Hartley-Brewer on Sky, but there was this sort of cast of usual suspects, right? And one of the great things about Zoom is now it's accepted that people are competent enough to actually be interviewed from home. You actually get people who aren't necessarily from London who occasionally know what they're talking about. I don't know if you've noticed this in news programs.
Yeah, experts,
but you actually get someone who is a professor of so-and-so. Now, let's face it, if you're a fucking virologist, I don't want you travelling down to London at 5 a.m. I want you cracking a bloody vaccine, mate, right? But he can appear on Zoom for half an hour and actually answer some questions with an intelligent and nuanced response. Instead, what you got was really opinion. You got opinion which is based on an entirely sort of oversimplified understanding of reality, by the way. And so I changed the whole idea about impartiality so that you had a bit of both. Because the odd thing is, by the way, I know, just as you never get, apart from Top Gear was probably the only right of centre BBC programme, wasn't it? Really? Although if you're really left wing, you'd say that Antiques Roadshow is commodity fetishism, and that property programmes exploit the violence inherent in the system. And you could argue that property programmes are kind of right wing, which I guess I'd accept that. But I haven't really heard a Marxist point of view from anybody on telly. A proper anarchist view. It's always this kind of, it's kind of like here's the right wing doctrine, which is boring actually. Here's some left wing doctrine, and as a result, what the real problem about these mental frameworks through which people operate is not that they're wrong, because every framework's wrong, but they're incredibly creatively limiting, right?
Yes.
So all I'm saying with the BBC is, look, don't listen to a doctrinaire. I love the Adam Smith Institute, they're mates, right? And they're also quite Austrian, so they probably agree with me, actually. But don't go to a doctrinaire organisation about how it must be privatised and entirely run through the profit motive, blah, 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 blah. All I'm saying is there's a blurrier way of handling this, where when you factor in, one, the complexity of what you're selling, which is not just the delivery of a programme to an individual, right? I can derive value from things I don't use. I'm not so narrowly constrained in my model. That when you understand the complexity of what you're selling, when you understand the complexity of the economics of a product which effectively has zero marginal cost attached, okay, then some sort of blurrier pricing where I think people would have a reasonable amount of choice as to what they watched and how deep they wanted to go. And I think the variable pricing would need to be not around ring-fenced content, but around a weighting somehow.
Yes.
Okay, I'll give you a very simple example, right? Did you watch the Valhalla murders?
No, I didn't know. No.
Was it on Sky?
I have no idea. I've not heard of it, actually.
Okay, it's quite good. Icelandic crime, Scandi noir, although technically not Scandi, Nordo noir, I guess you'd have to say. And the interesting thing about that, if you think about what is a programme worth, well, would I pay £2 to watch each episode? No. On the other hand, if you said episode 5 appears next week, or you can watch it now for £2, I'd pay £2 in a heartbeat. So the value of a programme is contextually determined. It's not, it doesn't have a simple unitary value. And this is why the Austrians, at least, were often they never went anywhere because they accepted that psychology was essentially the dominant factor in value, or a dominant factor in value creation. They were never able to do any maths, so therefore they got essentially frozen out of economics faculties because it's a requirement to teach mathematical models for everything, despite the fact that Adam Smith didn't use them, or Keynes very much, actually. Come to think of it. But what we need is actually to brainstorm loads of alternatives and say, okay, we need to understand these 6 or 7 conflicting facts. We don't simply consume programs on our own. Okay, there is a value to consuming commonly shared content, stories, etc. Right? We need to, so we need to be sure that we don't ever create programming which, by default, only 20% of the population can watch.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we probably do need to reflect that there are parts of the BBC which cost an enormous amount of money. So, Radio 4, what is interesting is, I think it's true that 3 years of Jonathan Ross would pay for 1 year of Radio 4. I think.
Well, Jonathan Ross is on ITV now.
Oh, so he's when he was on BBC.
Yeah.
So So it's. I think the things where the BBC adds value and the places where it sort of spends money are not very well aligned.
Yeah.
Equally, you've got to accept the fact that audience figures are not a brilliant guide, and that advertising doesn't cater for the niche interests of the poor. Caters very well for the niche interests of the rich. Golf, wonderful. Okay. Dog racing, not so hot. Right. Okay. In terms of advertising funding. So you've got to factor that thing in. And the fact that, if you believe in any purpose of the BBC, it has to, consider different parts of the populace. You also need to factor in, the fact that people don't like necessarily paying for things the way that economists think they should. And that there's an opportunity to extract value. One of the trade-offs you've got to make is between simultaneous viewing and the ability to price discriminate through charging people more to watch something first.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a complicated one. I mean, as with those crime dramas where you can watch the whole thing on download in one massive binge, right? Well, I would pay to do that because it saves me waiting for another week for the denouement.
Well, a good example would be I watched The Mandalorian on Disney Plus, and the only reason I have which is a Star Wars spin-off, but because I quite like it, but the only reason I have a subscription to Disney Plus, because I don't watch anything else on Disney, is the fact that they have this series that runs weekly. They put out a new one every single week. That keeps me subscribing until, of course, the series ends, and then I'll cancel it and resubscribe once there's another series. But I think that's quite a clever...
That was the central finding of HBO, which is that you need to have, in order to get people paying £7 a month, you need one killer thing. One thing I make a point of, by the way, is... You can grumble about the BBC license fee, but it's worth saying that all the technological developments we've had mean that although we watch probably less BBC as a proportion of our overall viewing, the BBC is actually more valuable to us because things like Sky Plus, things like downloads, things like catch-up TV, things like watching Kenneth Clark's Civilization at 2:00 in the morning, and Time Shift, all make that content more valuable. It's fair to say, right? Now, let's be honest about this before we go, the BBC's terrible value for money. Well, hold on. You've just had a load of technological ideas which make the BBC archive literally 20 times more valuable than it was. I mean, it was 20 years ago. The BBC archive was, other than a few 2:00 in the morning Open University repeats, was totally worthless. You had, I suppose they could flog them on video. That was the one thing you could do. But everything to do with Time Shift means that the quality of the television you are watching... I mean, 22 million people used to watch 3-2-1. You don't remember that, do you?
No.
Ted Rogers did a thing like that, which I can't imitate. It was a game show, and I can remember at university watching it with, particle physicists and people like this. One afternoon, very bored. And I can honestly say that, never mind me, the particle physicists found the rules of this program completely incomprehensible. Okay, it featured an animatronic dustbin that rolled on and I think delivered clues. The animatronic dustbin cost £12,000, which was almost sort of bankrupted the show. He was called Dusty Bin. Okay, I don't know why I'm explaining this to you. Go and look on it. It's bound to be on Channel.
I will.
23 million people watched the show, which was, to all intents and purposes, completely incomprehensible. Now, realistically speaking, one of the reasons why television has got better is partly it's become nichier, partly actually Time Shift means you can become much more selective. And so one of the reasons I don't grumble about the BBC is I'm a huge BBC 4 fan. Okay, now I would probably pay half the license fee just to have BBC 4, right? So given the enormous consumer surplus that pertains to television. I think getting too grumpy about it is missing the point.
Yeah, well, I think we're both agreed to end. Then I think we're both agreed that change is necessary, but it's just figuring out what the right model is, and hopefully, our politicians can be trusted to at least do that. So, Rory, thank you very much.
Okay, very, very clearly, someone will point out the apparent absurdity that I've used phrases like consumer surplus, okay, and I've used phrases like zero marginal cost. Now, I've used the phrases of economics while disparaging economics. Let me explain the distinction, because I think I owe your viewers an explanation. You should use economic tools, undoubtedly, in the process of inquiry. Because in the process of what you might call diagnosis, they're incredibly useful. In the process of both prognosis and prescription, they're incredibly dangerous. Because when you use them diagnostically, you're conscious of their limitations. But when you use them prescriptively, you're not. And this is the difference between the ideographic and the nomothetic. And by the way, if anybody goes, all Brexiters are thick. Look, they most of them haven't finished university. Well, that was largely because they're older, by the way, and most people didn't go to university in 1957, right? Okay, just so you know, I found the European Union an excessively nomothetic project. I think it's quite useful for that purpose, and then you can leave it, walk away, because that is undoubtedly true. But then it's not, it's the kind of Soviet urge to govern centrally, which is driven by, I think, a power urge, then leads people to force people into a mental straitjacket for the purposes of comprehensibility, which is generally hopelessly misaligned with what those people deep down really want. I'll tell you a lovely tip from advertising. There's a book, How to Become an Advertising Man, James Webb Young, right? And he says, these are the kind of things you need to know before you do advertising. There's there's knowledge of markets, knowledge of media, knowledge of and then the one of them is absolutely vital, knowledge of the specific situation. Because every situation is significantly different. And so the urge to actually impose generalized models on the world, first for purposes of comprehension, and then secondly and worse for the purpose of control, is totally, other than a few weird anarchists and people, this problem is not well understood, but it seems to be universal. And I see it not only on the left, by the way, you see it within companies and corporations.
Yes,
as well.
Yes, yeah. Well, gosh, I mean, we've got quite a lot to process there, I think, but I'll be interested to see what the comments are, because I think instinctively most of my viewers will be pro getting rid of the license fee, but I think you have given people a lot of food for thought, so thank you very much for doing so.
Just as there was a satisfactory route to rail privatization, I believe, and there probably was a much better way of doing mobile phone networks than a spectrum auction. Which did a very good job of raising money for the government, but arguably made the quality of the service, which is more important economically, I would argue. I mean, by near bankrupting a load of mobile phone operators, you didn't do the public a brilliant service either, okay? So all I'm saying is that I think there is a creative experimentation space here for something which actually has some of the ingredients of both.
Yeah.
And I think the problem with the bias and the coverage, by the way, is partly actually it's partly a product of the kind of people they employ, right? It's partly a product of being in London with a load of wankers who ponce around London all the time. Okay, and ITV undoubtedly has a much better job of understanding North, right? I think you'd back me up on that.
Yeah.
Okay, and but it's also, I think, a product of the way in which impartiality is interpreted, which is that that every subject has to be carried from both angles, which is simply ridiculous. Okay.
Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you very much for your time. You've been an absolute treat, as I knew you would be. So thank you for being so generous with your time as well.
Can I make a very interesting comment for Spectator?
Of course you can.
Every single journalist questioned Cummings over the trip to Durham, and it did lead me to think that had his parents lived in Surrey, no one would have considered it even remotely egregious as a behaviour.
Do you think
so?
Not
a single journalist. They were all so busy evidencing outrage, moral opprobrium and outrage, which is basically the left-wing equivalent of the Daily Mail. Ooh, it's one rule for you and it's not, etc. Right? Okay. Not a single journalist spotted that he went to a house that was almost certainly infected with COVID and then went straight back into Downing Street. His trip to Durham was epidemiologically irrelevant, right? I would confidently say if you assuming he didn't stop on the M1 and gob at passers-by, right? It did not contribute to the spread at all. You would also say, okay, well, it's a bit unfair for the local health service, but actually 250,000 Londoners had bunked out of London before lockdown. So there was this mass exodus anyway. But going from a flat with COVID in it back into the seat of power strikes me as a much weirder and much more dubious behaviour. Now, I don't know what the thinking is behind that, but nobody questioned that.
No.
I'm sitting there going, but this is fucking weird, right? And someone else did say on Twitter, they said basically every single journalist just asked the same question.
That's a problem.
And the idea of investigative journalism is a nonsense if every single person is investigating the same fucking thing.
No, it really, really is. That's a problem. And I'm afraid, an massive expansion of broadcast journalism clearly hasn't solved that particular issue, has it? But anyway, that is a topic for a whole other show.
A whole other discussion.
Yeah, it really is. It really is.
I better get. I better go and get a drink.
Yeah,
I've got another,
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
No, bye-bye.
Bye-bye now. Now, I'm sure you'll be absolutely desperate to hit that subscribe button after watching that. Rory is a real treat. Well, let me know, has he convinced you on any of his arguments on the BBC? I'll be interested to find out. I'll see you next time.